Hey there, with you, it's Ed, and I am super happy to be able to be here with you once again in a takeout session. We are in the middle of our series on engaging culture, and we've had a week a couple of weeks ago where Dustin kind of unpacked our engaged culture vision and what that means for us. He also spent some time in the takeout before this one working with us on our very first session about Paul on Mars Hill and engaging culture by starting right where they are and seeing where God is at work already in the culture around us. Love that. We're going to go into a different story of Paul today, and it's one that takes us to a very odd spot. I'm kind of actually really excited to share this takeout with you because we're going to talk about engaging people or engaging culture in the middle of difficult seasons of life. So I'll unpack that here in a second. So we've got some engaged culture stuff coming up for Converge that we're super excited about. And when you're doing well and life's okay and you're surrounded by people that you really know and love, it's easy to kind of get on board with this stuff. And in fact, we want you to, right? So coming up in just a few weeks is our Easter week. Man, we've got a way to engage culture by stepping in with us on the Saturday before Easter at the park, where we are going to have a Stations of the Cross, where we're going to have a bounce house, where we're going to feed people, where we're going to do a Easter egg hunt for kids. We've got face painting. We've got friends, we've got new people we're going to make friends from, that are just walking through the park. It's going to be easy. That's like a really easy yes. Let's engage culture. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fascinating, and it's going to be free. So, hey, what do you think? So it's gonna be great, and it's easy to come out to that event and say, what can I do to help? How can I get on board? Everything from donating eggs and candy ahead of time to helping cook, to helping with the Easter egg hunt, to the bounce house. Lots of ways to engage culture. It's an easy onboard. Or Dustin's storytellers, right? Getting to go with them to one of the Midtown bars when they play and do a worship night there. Man, it's so much fun to be able to be there with friends and listen to music and, tip one back and just really do that to engage culture in a really way that we would all enjoy. The community dinners are another way to do that, right? We've got these great opportunities that we do to feed those without homes in our area. And so we get to engage the culture by all of us gathering, a bunch of people gathering around, creating a space, making dinners and putting food together, along with clothes and showers and all sorts of other amenities. And once a month do that. That's such a fantastic. I love that we have people doing that. Christmas is another way we engage culture, as was Halloween and Treat the Streets. So many great opportunities to engage culture. And because that's a part of our vision, right? We're going to do this stuff, and we're going to help you do this stuff because that's what we want to be about doing. And so when we get along, when we get to do stuff together, when we get to do it and have a lot of fun, that's a great way of engaging culture. And we think, man, this is good. Okay, we got this. We can do this. But, and now here's the wrinkle. Here's the monkey wrench. How do we engage culture when it's not so fun? How do we engage when, because of something we've done or because of somebody who's just downright mean or who's just not wanting to help us have a really good day, right? How do we engage when we're pushed down into the mud, where we get dirty into the filth of the world, or when we're backs up against the wall, or we feel like we've been thrown into a fire? How do we engage culture then? I mean, those times are confusing, painful. Sometimes we might feel guilt or shame. I mean, what do we do about that? I'm talking about, for example, times when life, or maybe a part of life, is in upheaval. Or maybe I'm in a challenging season. Maybe my job is a hassle, or I'm being hassled at my job. Maybe it's a bad boss or a difficult coworker. And, how do I stand for Christ there? What about maybe it's a lot of conflict with my family? How do I stand for Christ there? How do I engage culture there? How about maybe it's dealing with a difficult neighbor or in a difficult neighborhood? Maybe you live in the hood, and it's just really tough. How do I do that in this place that so doesn't want to hear my message? What about if we're in a place where we're embroiled in the politics of where I live or where I work, and it feels like everything, especially here in the West Coast, feels like maybe the things that I may have want to say are running so contrary to what we think is popular opinion. And finally, maybe one idea is where there's guilt and shame for my sin and brokenness. How do I gauge culture when I'm walking through that difficulty? Going back to the politics one, I've got a friend who, I haven't seen her for a while, but a friend, her name is Carla. She works at the state capitol or has worked there. And I've always been fascinated about how does she engage the culture around her when she works with a very politicized system that sometimes works so anti what I would think would be a biblical worldview. How do you stand and do that, and do it with joy? And how do you do a job like that with being able to do it at your very best when sometimes it feels like it's the very worst? So that's the question, right? How do we engage culture when culture is at its worst? Like when I'm having trouble interacting in one or more places in my life. How do I witness when my life is a mess? Engaging culture is hard enough in the best of times. The statistic is that only 90% of Christians have never led another person to Christ. That means that out of 100 sitting, in one room, only 5 people have ever had the privilege to do that. I'm not trying to give that statistic to make you think that you're somehow really bad. I'm trying to say it's hard. We have a tough time engaging culture in the best of times. How do we do it in the worst of times? I mean, in the best of times, we maybe have a little bit of a fear of rejection. Maybe we don't feel equipped. Maybe we struggle to be thrilled with Jesus in our story in the moment, But in the worst of times, if you think that fear of rejection or not feeling equipped or not delighting with Jesus in our story is a challenge, what about in that when you feel like you're being put upon, or where you being singled out, or where you're not being listened to, or where your life is messed up, or you've your life is shipwrecked, you've turned over your boat, and you feel like you're treading water when you should be in the boat and cruising the lake. How do we engage when culture is at its worst? Like for example, when culture is when is it at its worst with people? Well, one of the times that I think of when we're at our worst is when we're at war. I mean, it might be actual war. Some people are actually having to fight that. We know that in the news. But there's also political war, tribal wars. And I just mean the tribal attitudes that we have right here in our own backyard. Cultural wars that go on where people cannot seem... It's not that we can just agree to disagree. We have to be strictly at odds with each other. Like you're bad or you're wrong if you're not on my side of things. Maybe it's a family war where we just can't seem to get along. When we're at war, how do we engage culture there? I think of World War II, reading about Christians who lived in Germany. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, a brilliant mind who had to figure out, how do I stand for Christ in Germany in the middle of what's happening all around me with Hitler and the Holocaust? How do we engage culture when we're at war? How do we engage culture? It's at its worst when people don't care about others' points of views or perspective, where I feel like I don't matter, or what I value doesn't matter, or maybe I have to work in a place or live in a place that has a very anti-Christian worldview. Now what do I do? How do I engage when people are at their worst? Like when I try to talk to people about my story and it feels like there's apathy, or people are dismissive or volatile or even hostile. What do I do there? When we hit those times, I think it feels like we're kind of like that fish swimming against the flow, right? You feel like you're that one fish going this way and everybody else is going that way. And it's like, well, I guess I can just engage culture because I bump into everybody on the way up, right? But it doesn't seem like everything's headed my direction. What typically happens with us in these seasons? Let's start there. When we feel like we're in the most challenging of circumstances, no matter what God is there or what it is, what do we usually do? I think one of two things. Number one, I think we first thing we do is we withdraw. We shrink back, right? I just don't feel like I can share. I don't feel like somebody wants to listen to me. I feel like I'll just keep my faith private, right? And so we find a good way to say that. Well, my faith is my own. It's a private faith, and I just don't, want to make people feel bad, so I don't share my story with people. And so I don't engage culture. Perhaps my life is so messed up in my challenging situation that I feel shame or guilt or embarrassed or pain, and it's maybe just hard. I don't hide it because I don't want to create conflict. I just hide it because I am, I feel like who'd want to listen? I've been in both of these where, I used to work a construction crew, and man, there were times that construction crew can be a really challenging place for a person of faith at times. And sometimes I was really young. I was barely in my 20s, and it was like, none of these guys are going to listen. Who am I, right? I would think that. Who am I to share with these guys? Or I've been in places where I've, messed up my life. I've kind of got things upside down sometimes that I just feel the shame of it. And I'm like, wow, I'm not in a spot in my story where I can talk about what God is doing in my story. And these are real feelings. I know that I've had a lot of Christian friends, for example, who feel like the California culture is so anti-Christ that they move, right? We've got to move to Tennessee, a mecca for Christians right now for some reason. Or we got to move to Texas. We got to leave California. But my thing is, like, if all the Christians leave California, who's engaging the culture for Christ here, right? And so that's one thing we do. We withdraw, we shrink back. The other is we fight back. And that just creates conflict. We just get into it. We just, don't care about what they think. We only care about what really we think. And we're going to let you know. And I'm going to tell you what's right. And I'm going to tell you what's wrong with the way you think. I don't know that actually produces good results. I think actually either way, our witness is adversely affected. So what do we do? I remember when years and years and years ago, before I came to California, we had, I looked at possibly taking a pastoring job, an associate job in a church in Centerville, Iowa. And I don't know. I've since, I don't know why Iowa. I don't know why Centerville. It was certainly not a good cultural fit for me. I could tell. But there was a huge Rubbermaid plant in town. And I remember sitting at a meeting over dinner with the board and spouses and some others there, and hearing the people who work at the plant complain that edicts were being made that people could not share their faith when they were at work. And I'm thinking, and they were upset and they were angry, right? They were getting big and they were wanting to get combative. And I'm thinking to myself, what did you do that made them have to make HR make a rule that you couldn't talk about your faith somewhere in a flyover state in Iowa? I was like, you must have really been obnoxious. Because that's not the way to go either. So what do? Well, we're going to take a look at the life of Paul, and once again, as we are this season. And I want to unpack 4 principles that we can learn out of this passage with Paul about how we can engage culture in a difficult season. So let's begin. Paul and Silas are actually, it's a story about where they go to prison, but we're going to start before that about like what got them there. So we're gonna start here, and it says, one day as we were going down to the place of prayer, we met a slave girl who had a spirit that enabled her to tell the future. She earned a lot of money for her masters by telling fortunes. She followed Paul and the rest of us shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God, and they have come to tell you how to be saved." Well, this went on day after day until Paul got so exasperated. Like that word actually means it's intensely irritated, frustrated to the point of unwise action or poor judgment. Have you ever been there? Right? We have those feelings when we feel like that culture is pressing in and it's somebody is irritating us like that. And we just finally, I've had enough. I've had it up to here. And so it says in the text that he turned and said to the demon within her, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her," and instantly it left her. Now, let's find out our first principle here from the text. One of the observations that we see here is that the words that the slave girl was using, she had a demon that allowed her to speak truth about things, have insight into what's going on spiritually, so she could tell fortunes. Well, what she was telling everyone about Paul and Silas was absolutely true, but it was wrong by association. Paul did not want a demon-possessed storyteller to be the herald for Jesus Christ and him and Silas. That is not the person that he wanted advertising them. And she just wouldn't stop and wouldn't stop and wouldn't stop. And so finally he tries to ignore it, but it wouldn't just go away. Have you been in those situations? Right? You just kind of bite your lip. You just hold your tongue. You're just trying to make, if it just goes away, then I can just do my thing and live my life and engage culture the way I want. But sometimes the things that are irritating us and create difficulties in our life, they just don't stop. And we try, we just have to put up with it, put up with it, and put up with it. What do you tend to do when you get then that intensely irritated? My guess is you do what Paul did and you do something rash. I think that's what Paul did here. He does something beautiful, but I think he just got to a point where it's like, I'm done. And he just turns and he's just, boom. There might have been a better way, right? When we do stuff, when we're frustrated and intensely irritated, sometimes we tend to get ourselves in trouble, which is what happens with Paul. But our point is this: even though I think he may have acted rashly, he did the right thing. And that's our first principle here, to engage the enemy, not the person. Notice in our text, it said that he spoke to the demon within her. He didn't criticize her. He didn't tell her she was bad. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He didn't tell her to go, he just tried to ignore her when she didn't go away on her own. He spoke to the enemy inside her. We have to speak to the enemy, not the person. The person or people that we feel like might be the ones that are holding us back or creating the challenges or the difficulty in this season, they're actually not our enemy. They too are a victim of the enemy. We see this very, very clearly in Ephesians, where in Ephesians 6, Paul writes these words to the church in Ephesus. He says a final word: "Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all of God's armor so that you will be able to stand firm against all the strategies of the devil or the enemy." And here it is, verse 12. "For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, like that slave girl, or that person in your work, or that person in your family, or that person in your neighborhood. We're not fighting against them, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, the spiritual realm, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places." We don't wrestle, we don't contend with flesh and blood. That's Ephesians 6:12 just makes that really clear. So if people are really the enemy, then we engage the enemy, and we do it through prayer, and then we say, and when we engage people, we can then engage them with grace and love and understanding. And when we focus on who the real problem is, we can do that. See, I think that people are used to being attacked by Christians, attacked back when they do that. And that's not the way to engage culture and be a good witness for the love of Christ. So we engage the enemy and not the people. let's go on with our story. So this girl, it now has the demon, the one in her that was giving her the ability to be the fortune tellers, to make those who basically owned her a lot of money. Everything shifts. Because it wasn't just the money. They're selling bling. They're selling, action figures and all sorts of, stuff, T-shirts. And they're making a lot of money off of her. And they can't anymore because her gift is gone. It says in verse 19, her master's hopes of wealth were now shattered. So they grabbed Paul and Silas and dragged them before the authorities at the marketplace. And they accused them right off the bat. They just say the whole city is in an uproar because of these Jews. Notice how they're derisive, right? That's the kind of thing we're talking about, where we're in this place, we're trying to engage a culture, but all it is like, well, you're a Jew, you're a Christian, you're one of those. And they shouted to the city officials that they were irritated and upset by what they had done. And then they said this, they are teaching customs that are illegal for us Romans to practice. Well, there's the tribalism that we were talking about, right? You Jews and us Romans, and we're going to make a distinction. And you might be sitting there like, but we're all people, right? But a mob then quickly forms against Paul and Silas, and the city officials ordered them stripped and beaten with wooden rods, and they were severely beaten. And then they were thrown into prison. And the jailer was ordered to make sure that they didn't escape. So the jailer put them into the inner dungeon and clamped their feet in stocks. So we have Paul and Silas, this amazing guy who last week we heard about how he engaged Athens like brilliantly. And they even were kind of halfway, some of them receptive to what he wanted to offer them. But man, everything falls apart here. And he is now in a really hostile place, and he finds himself surrounded by a culture that wants nothing to do with what he's trying to do or say at the moment. So he gets hauled into court, and then they start telling lies, lies, and more lies. And they are even severely punished. Beating with rods was actually a common punishment back then. Do you know they still do that, right? Singapore still has several types of caning laws on the books, and they cane people. It's still a common punishment there. And it was in their time too. So they were beaten with rods or caned. And there are times where we're going to feel wrongly treated. We're going to feel mocked. We're going to feel punished. We're going to feel victimized. We're going to think to ourselves, it's not fair. Why is this happening to me? What do we do and how do we engage then? Well, we see what Paul and Silas did. We engage with humility. Paul and Silas didn't fight back. They didn't state their Roman citizenship. They were both Roman citizens. When that guy says, these Jews excuse me, are making problems, Paul and Silas could have said, we're Romans. We're Roman citizens. But instead, they allowed themselves to be treated like second class. They know that life is not fair. And they remain silent by choice. There was a sense of humility here. It's the same thing that Jesus was. He was silent when he was going through his trial. It was irritating sometimes to Pilate as he was trying to grill him. But Jesus was like, I'm not going to offer really anything in my defense. If you say I'm king of the Jews, you say it. And he was silent. He didn't demand his rights and his right to be heard and I get to say this and how dare you make, he didn't argue back. They didn't defend their position. They didn't justify their actions. They took approach of humility. We may know we're in the right, but the question is this, because this is about our witness. This is about how we engage for Jesus here with our culture. Do we want to be right or do we want to be effective? And I think sometimes that question is crucial, because I think sometimes to be effective, the humility needs to be the thing that we lean into instead of showing and proving how right we are. So here's what happens with Paul and Silas. So instead of arguing and fighting back, they're put into the inner prison. Verse 25, around midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening. And suddenly there was a massive earthquake, and the prison door was shaken to its foundations. And all the doors immediately flew open, and the chains of every prisoner just fell off. jailer woke up to see the prison doors had been flung wide open. He assumed the prisoners had escaped, so he drew his sword to kill himself. But Paul shouted to him, "Stop! Don't kill yourself, we're all here." The jailer called for lights and ran to the dungeon and fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And Paul and Silas replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved along with everyone in your household." And they shared the word of the Lord with him and all who lived in his house. Well, we see Paul and Silas do two amazing things in the middle of the worst of circumstances. They are in the innermost dungeon. They are shackled. They are in a dark place, right? He had to call for a light. The jailer did. So they're in the darkness, and it's thinking of things where we could be to try to crush us, and figure like, how do we engage or act in this situation? I don't know what I would do. I think most of us would probably just start crying, or just kind of shrink back, like that whole idea, right? Shrink back into ourselves, or get really loud and angry and start yelling. But Paul and Silas don't do those typical actions. Instead, they pray. Praying is an inward act, right? It's typically done silently. But they began to pray, and they began to talk to God, and they began to find strength there. In the middle of some of the most challenging circumstances, no matter what they are or how we got there, praying is always a right response. It's an inward act that aligns us. It helps us align our hearts with God's heart, our will with his, so that we can then take the next step, which was singing. That's an outward act. Singing is heard by anybody. It's heard by everybody. And Paul and Silas start singing. And I'm sure it was, not the latest, song on the radio. It was probably, some song that they would sing in worship and sing to God, because that's what they were praying and singing together. And it was heard by many. And at that point, they, instead of looking at their circumstances, acknowledged that God is present. And the God who is always present now begins to act. It's amazing that when we start to take the right moves, when we engage rightly, when we engage well, even in the worst of circumstances, we could be in a horrible place of pain and frustration, and it's hard, and yeah, admittedly so, but when we take the right steps, God begins to act. It's like we free God up to do something amazing and supernatural. And that's what happens. And God breaks the chains and he opens the doors. How many of us need God to break chains and open doors? How many of us are just shrinking back and not doing anything? Or how many of us are engaging with criticism, or with to fight it and to force it, rather than saying, I'm going to go to God and let him break the chains and open the doors. And that's what he does. And the point is this: they engage with compassion. They engaged then with love for this jailer. They engaged with love as they prayed and sang, and that was vertical towards God. But when the jailer comes and says, "What must I do to be saved?" they didn't think, well, this is my chance. This is my time. See, I was right. This isn't I'm going to prove to you. I'm going to, do the I told you so stuff. I'm going to engage with compassion and say, I'm going to answer that question with great love. This is how they did it. They trusted God enough to stay put, right? They didn't run. The jailer thought he was going to commit suicide, but they trusted God enough to stay put in that jail, even after the earthquake, even after the chains were off, even after the doors were open. They stayed put. They loved the jailer enough to stop him from committing suicide. Don't kill yourself. We're all here. And they looked beyond the adversity and saw opportunity. And that's a really important concept. As we're talking about how to engage in difficult times or seasons, love and trust bring about the opportunity. That's how we do that. When we exhibit love and we trust God, the opportunities to engage culture in maybe some very unique and cool ways will present themselves. I really believe that. Well, let's go on with the story and finish it up. Verse 33, even at that hour of the night, the jailer cared for them, washed their wounds. Remember, they had been beaten with rods. Then he and everyone in his household were immediately baptized. Notice that they're now being taken care of. Notice that the wounds that were once inflicted in harm and hate are now being ministered to by the very ones who inflicted them. That's only what God can do. You talk about a message. You talk about a way to engage culture. That's very cool. When God shows up and those who were persecuting are now praising. It says that everyone in his household immediately was baptized. He brought them into his house, Paul and Silas, and set a meal before them, and he and his whole household rejoiced because they all believed God. And here's another point. We engage by building community together. I think that's great. I think back to how Converge got started out of some difficult circumstances. And it was hard, and there was some hostility. It wasn't always, not everybody was super thankful to be doing, the church plant to start Converge. Just kind of a reality. But we engaged community and went for it. And we are seeing some beautiful fruit start to come out of what Jesus has birthed in us coming together. It's just wonderful. I'd like to go back and just to kind of maybe illustrate with one more story this idea of what we do, and maybe one more point here about how we engage in difficult times. And I want to go back to the Old Testament, into a time where Israel had been, actually Judah, had been overthrown by the Babylonian Empire. Babylon had come in and sacked Jerusalem, tore it down, tore it apart, burned it down, and took all the intelligentsia, the smart ones, the fit ones, and they exported them all back to Babylon. We call it the exile. And there was a couple of really influential and very intelligent, very sharp young men that they actually put in charge of different places within the Babylonian government. One was Daniel. We're not going to go into his story, but he would be a great one. But there was these three men named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they had an opportunity to really have their faith challenged and figure out, how do I engage God in this culture? And so Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had set up this huge golden idol of himself. And it was, not his idea, somebody else's, but he loved it, because it serves him and makes him look good. And it's all about him. So he sets up this huge idol. And when the trumpets blare and the horns are played, everybody around it within hearing distance is supposed to turn and bow down to the idol. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right, are these three Hebrews. They serve God, not this idol. And they're like, what are we supposed to do here? I mean, this is going to happen. This is happening. What are we going to do? Do we go? Do we bow? I can see them having these conversations, and I can see them going, no, we can't. We got to stand. Yeah, but if we stand, we're going to get thrown into the fire. I mean, they're going to burn us alive. And essentially, that's what happens, right? And so they're given an opportunity, but they say, we're going to stand and we're not going to bow. And the king gets angry, and he orders them thrown into the fire. Oddly enough, those who threw them into the fire died from the heat. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were standing in the middle of the fire, and the king looks and says, doesn't it appear as there's 4 men now? Didn't we throw 3 men into the fire? And I see a 4th man, and he looks as though he's a god. And he orders them out of the fire. And it's a interestingly transformational moment for this king. And here's the deal. When we're in the middle of the fire, the last thing we often concern ourselves with is our witness. We're usually preoccupied with survival. That's what takes up our time. That's what consumes our energy. But our witness is the loudest when we're in the fire. Just like those 3 men, their witness was never as loud. They could not yell enough, argue enough, talk enough, preach enough, write enough. But when they were in the fire, they were noticed, and they were noticed well. And that's a key. When we're in the fire, when we're in a really difficult season, we can't shrink back, or we can't fight back. We've got to apply these appropriate principles so that our witness is strong and our witness is loud when we're in the middle of the fire. I think of the guys are reading this week in the Take Back Your Life by Levi Lusko. And chapter 13 is a chapter that was pain is a microphone. When we're in pain, it's like you have a microphone to shout something about your life in Christ to the world. And I want to read you this quote that I thought was amazing. He said, when you're a Christian and you're going through a great time of difficulty, you will notice that those around you who don't know Jesus Christ, especially those you've shared your faith with before, will lean in extra close. You told them that Jesus is the light of the world. Well, now your power's been cut, and they want to see if you can glow in the dark. And if they do see your claims proven true, you'll find a greater willingness on their part to trust Christ in their lives. So how do we engage culture when it's adverse? Final point. Engage by standing. We simply, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, like Paul and Silas, stand. And this is a very biblical idea. Ephesians 6, 11 to 13 puts it this way. Put on all of God's armor so that you can be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits on the heavenly places. Yeah, we read that one earlier. And then it says, verse 13, therefore put on every piece of God's armor, so you'll be able to resist that enemy in the time of evil. Then after the battle, you will be standing firm. Peter says it this way in 1 Peter 5, 6 to 11. So humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time he will lift you up in honor. Give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you. Stay alert. Watch out for your enemy, the devil. He prowls like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Stand firm against him. Be strong in your faith. Remember that your family of believers all over the world is going through a similar kind of suffering. In his kindness, God called you to share it in his eternal glory by means of Christ Jesus. So, after you have suffered a little while, he will restore, support, strengthen you, and he will place you on a firm foundation. All power to him forever. 1 Corinthians 16:13, Paul wrote these words to the Corinthian church. He says, be on your guard. Stand firm in the faith. Be courageous. Be strong. And do everything with love. Notice how he tacks on this idea of love. We can't just be strong and be courageous, because we might tend to want to fight. But he's like, but do everything with love. I think of the windstorm that we had a while back. Even lost a little tree. It was dead already in my front yard, but it blew over because it didn't have any roots. Right? And finally, in that big last windstorm a few weeks ago, just boom. And which was great, because I just chopped it up and put it in the green bin, you know. But the strongest trees, the ones that won't blow down, the ones that are going to always be there, are the ones with the deepest roots. And they stand strong in the middle of any storm. So, to end, I'd like to end with a prayer back to the chapter 13 in Take Back Your Life with Levi Lusko. Here's his prayer that ends this chapter, from which I took the quote. He says this: Father, help me to not waste my pain. Remind me in the face of my most difficult days that you are working in my circumstances and turning my mess into a message. And that's my prayer for us, for you, is that in the difficult seasons of life, we stand and we engage. God bless you guys. Love you.